Let us do part 2 of syllogism, moods and enthymemes. Here we'll be studying the rules of categorical syllogism. The first rule is the rule of structure. The first rule of structure is that the syllogism in general must contain three and only three propositions, not less nor more. That is, two premises and a conclusion, total three propositions. Let us take an example. All animals are wild, all tigers are animals, therefore all tigers are wild. Here, all animals are wild and all tigers are animals is the premise. And the conclusion is therefore all tigers are wild. Thus we have three propositions. 1. All animals are wild. 2. All tigers are animals. And 3. Therefore all tigers are wild. So it's a categorical syllogism. Now when one violates the rule of categorical syllogism, that is 1.1, the rule of structure, that the categorical syllogism must contain three and only three propositions, then we commit the fallacy of argument of Syllogisms, and the argument ceases to be a categorical syllogism. Let us take an example. All buildings are tall, all trees are tall, some men are tall, therefore some men are buildings. Here we have three premises and one conclusion. That is, all buildings are tall is the first premise, all trees are tall is the second premise, some men are tall is the third premise, and the conclusion is some men are buildings. So total we have four propositions, that is more than 3. So we commit the fallacy of argument of Syllogisms, and this argument ceases to be a categorical syllogism. Let us understand the second rule of structure 1.2. There must be three and only three terms in a categorical syllogism. Let us understand this. Which are the three terms? The minor term or the subject term, measure or the predicate term, and the middle term. Let us understand this with an example. All flowers are red, some flowers are roses, therefore some roses are red. Here roses is the subject of the conclusion. This is the first term. Then the second is red, which is the predicate of the conclusion. This is second. Then the third is the middle term, flowers. So we have three terms in this categorical syllogism. Now we come to the next. When one violates the rule 1.2 of the rule of structure, that is, there must be three and only three terms in a categorical syllogism, then the fallacy of four terms or equivocation is committed. Here, generally, this fallacy is committed when any term is used ambiguously, that is, when any term has more than one meaning. Let us understand this with an example. All happiness depends on the liver. Some people donate liver. Therefore, some people donate happiness. Your liver is the middle term. The liver in the measure premise indicates that the person who lives, whereas the liver in the second premise indicates that it is the organ of the body. So thus we have four terms. Just because the word liver, which is the middle term, is ambiguous, it is considered as two terms. So liver, the person who lives, is one term, and the person and liver as the organ of the body is the second term, and people is the third, and happiness is the fourth. So middle term 1, middle term 2, then we have subject term 3 and the predicate term 4. Thus we have 4 terms. So this fallacy is called the fallacy of 4 terms, and it is also called as equivocation. And just because the middle term is ambiguous, it can be called as the fallacy of ambiguous middle. Before we go to the rule 2, the rule of distribution, we must understand how the terms are distributed in categorical propositions. Categorical proposition, the subject term and the predicate term. We know that there are 4 types of categorical propositions. Let us see A proposition. The subject term is distributed, whereas the predicate term is undistributed. We know already when is it distributed and when it is not. When it refers to the whole class, then entire class, then it is said to be distributed, and when it does not refer to the whole class but to some members of the class, then it is said to be undistributed. So in A proposition, the subject term is distributed, whereas the predicate term is undistributed. Then E proposition, the subject term as well as the predicate term is distributed. Then I proposition, both the subject term as well as the predicate term is undistributed, and in O proposition, the subject term is undistributed, whereas the predicate term is distributed. Now let us understand rule 2, the rule of distribution of terms. Here the first rule of distribution of terms is 2.1. The middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. Why do you think that the middle term must be distributed at least one in the premises? Because the function of the middle term in a categorical syllogism is to unite the major term and the minor term. And the middle term cannot perform its function unless it is distributed at least once in the premises. You already know that a term is distributed when it refers to the whole class, and it is undistributed when it refers to the part of the class. Let us understand this with an example. All games are enjoyable. Some games are interesting. Therefore, some interesting things are enjoyable. Here, the first premise has the word all. So it's an A proposition. The second premise has the word some, so it's an I proposition, and the conclusion has the word some, so it's an I proposition. Now games is the middle term which lies as the subject of a proposition. So we already know that the subject term in a proposition is distributed. Now games lies as the subject of I proposition, and we already know that I proposition, the subject term refers to the part of the class, and therefore it is undistributed. But this argument will be valid because the middle term is distributed at least once in the premise, that is in the measure premise it is distributed. Now we come to the violation of this rule. 2.1 of the rule of distribution of terms, that is, the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. Let us take an example. Then if we violate this rule, then we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. An example is all tables are wooden, all chairs are wooden, therefore all chairs are tables. Here the first premise has the word all, so it's an A proposition. And The second also has all, so it's an A proposition. The third also has all, so it's an A proposition. So all the three are A propositions. Now here wooden is the middle term, which stands as the predicate of A proposition in the measure premise. So it's undistributed, and it also is the predicate of the minor premise of A proposition. So again it is undistributed. So both the middle term is undistributed in both the premises, the measure premise as well as the minor premise. Hence, the fallacy committed here is the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now let us see rule 2 of rule of distribution of terms. 2.2, no term can be distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the premises. Why? Because when a term is distributed in the conclusion but not distributed in the premises, that means that the conclusion has gone beyond the evidences in the premises, and the argument being deductive, it will be invalid. And this is a mistake. So it's called the fallacy of illicit process of terms. Now, let us take an example to understand this. Now, here, no intelligent persons are cowards. All Indians are intelligent, therefore, no Indians are cowards. So, here we have the first premise, we have no in it, so it's an E proposition. The second premise, we have all in it, so it's an A proposition. The conclusion has no in it, so it's an E proposition. Now, your Indians is the subject term, which is the subject of the conclusion. Indians is the subject of the conclusion. It is the minor term, and it is distributed because it is the subject of E proposition. Since the subject of E proposition is always distributed, so it will be distributed in the conclusion. Now, Indians is the subject of A proposition in the minor premise, and it is also distributed because it is the subject of A, and subject of A is always distributed. So, the minor term Indians is distributed in the conclusion as well as in the premise. Now we come to the word coward. Coward is the predicate of the conclusion, and it is distributed in the conclusion because it is the predicate of E proposition, and the predicate of E proposition is always distributed. Then it lies in the first premise, which is the measure premise. There also, let us see whether it is distributed or not. Yes, it is distributed because it is the predicate of E proposition again. So, predicate of E is always distributed. So, it is distributed in the conclusion as well as in the premise. So, the whole, even the middle term is distributed here. So, the question does not arise of invalidity, means it is a valid argument. Since all the terms are distributed and it is not violating the rule, in short. When one violates the rule 2.2, that is the rule of distribution of terms, which means no term can be distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the premise, then it commits the fallacy of illicit process. Since the fallacy of illicit process is of two types, there are two types of terms in the conclusion, that is the subject term as well, minor term as well as the major term. So there will be two types of illicit process. The first is the fallacy of illicit minor is committed when the subject term is distributed in the conclusion but undistributed in the minor premise. Let us take an example. All large things are baskets, all baskets are delicate things, therefore all delicate things are large. Here the first premise is having the word all, so it's an A proposition. And the second is having all, so it's an A proposition. Conclusion is having all, so it's an A proposition. So now here the word delicate things is the subject of the conclusion and it is the subject of A proposition. So it is distributed in the conclusion. Whereas in the minor premise, it is delicate things is the predicate of a proposition, so it is undistributed. So it commits the fallacy of illicit minor. Let us understand the second fallacy of illicit process, that is the fallacy of illicit measure. It is committed when the measure term is distributed in the conclusion but undistributed in the measure premise. Let us take an example. All clever people are successful. No boys are clever, therefore no boys are successful. Here the first premise has the word A, has the word all, so it's an A proposition. The second premise has the word no, so it's an E proposition. The third, that is the conclusion, has the word no in it, so it's an E proposition. Now, here the word successful is the predicate of the conclusion and it is also the predicate of E proposition, so it is distributed. It is called the measure term and it lies in the first premise, which is A proposition. It's the predicate of A, so it's undistributed. Hence, it commits the fallacy of illicit measure. Now, let us understand the third rule, the rule of quality. First rule of quality is 3.1. No conclusion can be drawn from two negative propositions. Let us take an example. No fruits are vegetables. Some vegetables are not leafy. Here the first proposition has the word no in it, so it's an E proposition. The second proposition has some not in it, so it's an O proposition. Both the propositions are negative propositions, so no conclusion can be drawn from it. The first one is universal negative and the second is particular negative. When one violates the rule 3.1 of the rule of quality, that is, no conclusion can be drawn from two negative propositions, then the fallacy of negative premises is committed. Let us take an example. Some dogs are not black, no dogs are cats, therefore some cats are not black. Now the first premise has the word some not in it, so it's an O proposition. The second premise has the word no in it, so it's an E proposition. Therefore, the conclusion which is drawn is wrong. As per the rule, no conclusion can be drawn from it. The conclusion drawn is O proposition. So here we commit the fallacy of negative premises because both the premises are negative and no conclusion can be drawn from it. Now let us understand the rule 3, the rule of quality. The second rule, that is the 3.2, when either of the premises is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Let us understand this with an example. Some girls are not intelligent, all girls are beautiful, therefore some beautiful ladies are not intelligent. Here the word some not is used in the first premise, so it's an O proposition. Second premise all is used, so it's an A proposition. The conclusion has some not in it, so it's an O proposition. The first premise is particular negative. It's an negative premise. So the conclusion is also negative. This is applicable to this rule. It fits in this rule. When one violates the rule 3.2 of the rule of quality, that is, when either of the premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative, then the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise is committed. Let us take an example. No students are regulars, some clever girls are students, therefore some clever girls are regular. Here the first premise has no in it, so it's an E proposition. The second has some in it, so it's an I proposition, and the conclusion has some in it, so it's an I proposition. The first premise is universal negative. It's a negative proposition. But the conclusion is I, which is particular affirmative, so it's an affirmative proposition. Hence, it violates the rule 3.2, that is, if the premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Hence, commits the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Third rule of the rule of quality, that is 3.3. When both the premises are affirmative, the conclusion must be affirmative. Let us take an example. All games are intellectual, all intellectual things are logical, therefore all logical things are games. The first premise has all in it, so it's an A proposition. The second has all in it, so it's an A proposition. The third conclusion has all in it, so it's an A proposition. Now here, since both the premises are affirmative, the conclusion is also affirmative. It fits in the third rule of quality. When one violates the rule 3.3, that is the rule of quality, that is, when both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative, then the argument is invalid. Let us take an example. All elephants are herbivorous. All elephants are animals, therefore no animals are herbivorous. Here the first premise has all in it, so it's an A proposition. The second premise has all in it, so it's an A proposition. The conclusion has no in it, so it's an E proposition. Here the first premise is affirmative, the second premise is affirmative, but the conclusion is negative. So it violates the third rule of quality. Besides this, let us also check whether it commits other fallacies. Here, animals is the subject term of the conclusion. It is indicated by S. It lies in the second premise, which is the minor premise. It is okay, and the herbivorous is the predicate of the conclusion, which lies in the first premise, which is the major premise. Here, both the subject and the predicate term are distributed in the conclusion, whereas they are undistributed in the premises, because they are predicate of A proposition in the premises, whereas they are predicate of E proposition in the conclusion. So the whole argument commits the fallacy of both illicit major and illicit minor. Now we'll be studying corollaries from rules. From the given rules, we get some more rules. That is 4.1. From particular premises, no conclusion can be drawn. Means suppose the premises are II or IO or OI or OO, then no conclusion can be drawn. Let us take an example. Some Brahmins are fair-skinned, some Brahmins are pujaris. Both these premises are particular proposition. The first is having some in it, so it's an I proposition. Second also is having some in it, so it's an I proposition. Both are particular propositions, so no conclusion can be drawn from it. We go to 4.2. If one of the premise is particular, then the conclusion will be particular. Let us take an example. All fruits are ripe, some fruits are mangoes, therefore some mangoes are ripe. The first premise has the word all in it, so it's an A proposition. The second premise has some in it, so it's an I proposition. The conclusion has some in it, so it's an I proposition. Now the second premise is particular proposition, and therefore the conclusion must be particular proposition. Now we come to the third corollary, that is 4.3. From a particular measure premise and a negative minor premise, no conclusion can be drawn. Let us take an example. Some persons are ethical. No ethical beings are terrorists. Therefore, no conclusion can be drawn. The first premise has some in it, so it's an I proposition. The second has no in it, so it's an E proposition. The first premise, that is the measure premise, is a particular proposition. And the second premise, that is minor premise, is a negative premise. Therefore, no conclusion can be drawn from it. These are the three corollaries. Thus, we have learned the rules of syllogism. Let us recollect them. The first rule is the rule of structure, in which we have two rules. That is, the categorical syllogism must contain three and only three propositions. When we violate this rule, the argument ceases to be a categorical syllogism and it commits the fallacy of argument of rights. The second rule is that it must contain three and only three terms. When this rule is violated, then it commits the fallacy of four terms, and that is equivocation. Now we come to the second rule, the rule of distribution of terms, in which we have three rules. The first is that the middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. When we violate this rule, then we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. The second rule is the subject term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the minor premise. When we violate this rule, we commit the fallacy of illicit minor. Then the third rule is that the predicate term is not distributed in the conclusion unless it is distributed in the measure premise. So this rule, when violated, commits the fallacy of illicit measure. Then we have the third rule, the rule of quality, in that we have three rules again. The first rule is that no conclusion can be drawn from two negative premises. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of negative premises. Then the second rule is that when either of the premises is negative, the conclusion must be negative. If this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from negative premise. And the third rule is that when both the premises are affirmative, conclusion must be affirmative. When this rule is violated, then the argument is fallacious and it is invalid argument. Then we have the four corollaries, that is, the rules which follow from the above rules. First is, from the two particular premises, no conclusion can be drawn. When this rule is violated, then we commit the fallacy and the argument becomes invalid. The second is that if one of the premises is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. If this rule is violated, again the argument will be invalid um, and the argument will commit the fallacy. Then the third rule is that from a particular measure premise and a negative minor premise, no conclusion can be drawn. If this rule is violated, again the argument will be invalid and will commit the fallacy of illicit measure and some other fallacies, depending upon the argument. Thus, we have studied the rules of categorical syllogism and when violated, what fallacies they commit. Thank you.